All right. Well, once again, welcome everybody to our first session of Introductory Late Egyptian, the language of Ramses. Really great to have you all join. I think pretty much everybody on this call is familiar with the history of how this study group came about, but for the benefit of anybody who finds it later in the future on YouTube, maybe a few words of what the idea behind this is. This all started with a course given by Egyptologist Christian Casey, who had the idea of essentially starting from the more recent forms of Egyptian, namely Coptic and then Late Egyptian, and working the way backwards from the better known to the less well-known, rather than jumping in right with Middle Egyptian, which is what you typically do at a university. Now, all the textbooks out there, they start with Middle Egyptian. And so he put together a course that would be doing Late Egyptian from scratch. Most of us were in this course. Unfortunately, it went on hiatus in April last year. And I've talked with Christian several times in between. He definitely wants to do it again one day and wants to write that book. But right now, it's just not possible. So the idea was, well, how can we make that idea a reality? It's just too good a thought to say, why don't we start with Late Egyptian without requiring Middle Egyptian as a first step? How can we somehow make this happen? And I took some inspiration here from a forum that many of you know, Glyph Study, where essentially you don't really have a teacher, but you have a course lead. And together the group works through a textbook and just goes chapter by chapter doing exercises. And what the course lead does is essentially send those exercises out and review them on a weekly basis. But apart from that, the group is working together without really having like a resident teacher. And I thought, let's adopt that model for Late Egyptian. And the book that we chose is The Language of Ramses by Neveu. It's one of the newer books on Late Egyptian. And the idea is that essentially we'll be working through that one in this group, chapter by chapter, doing the exercises, or doing exercises, I should say, because there aren't any in the book. So those will be added. And discussing things on Zoom calls and on Discord. So yeah, in terms of the book itself, The Language of Ramses, like all books on Late Egyptian that are currently on the market, it assumes that you know Middle Egyptian already. So during the first few sessions, we'll have to have a bridge to essentially go over the writing system and some of the key grammar features, like, for example, let's say articles, possessive pronouns, some basic preposition and genitive, and basic adverbial sentence. These are things that Neveu assumes you already know. And for many of you, that's true. We have a great group. There are people with lots of experience in Middle Egyptian, Coptic. I think we have 2 people who've studied Demotic at least. So great background, but we also have complete beginners, and that's the idea. The idea is to make it accessible to everybody. So to make that happen, I put some introductory materials together to get everybody up to speed. And then as we go along, I think we can more and more use the book. And essentially then those sessions would be, we read the chapter and go over the questions more than a PowerPoint. But the first few times I have put some PowerPoints together. So yeah, would like to go over that. But before we get started, any comments, any questions?
Just to say, hi, sorry I'm late. Just to say that I couldn't access the beginning of Christian Casey's last class. For some reason, I couldn't access it on Discord.
Oh, okay. That's interesting. You mean the Google document that I shared, right?
Yes, it kept saying you are not admitted to this group, but let's sort it out another time, just to let you know.
Okay, great. Good to know. Yeah, I was thinking thanks for pointing that out. That was the earlier course from Christian. I'm not going to use it because, of course, that's still his material. But I was thinking to get started on the uniliterals. He has some great exercises in there. So why reinvent the wheel? So let's look into that later. Thanks for pointing it out, Rebecca. All right. Anything else? Well, then I would say let's just get started. What I've prepared for today is a few key topics, namely, first of all, what is Late Egyptian? So how do we differentiate that stage of the language, and how is it different from earlier and later stages of the Egyptian language? Then I wanted to catch everybody up on Late Egyptian spelling and pronunciation. So how do we use hieroglyphs to write that language? And also, how is it pronounced to the best of our knowledge? I have an exercise for that, which is going to be probably about 20 minutes of going through the uniliterals, the one consonant signs, with a set of words. And then let's see, I do have a slide in here on the peculiarities of the late Egyptian writing system. You'll hear a lot of things written about it from people who are focusing primarily on classical Middle Egyptian, will say, oh, it's so chaotic and there's so much variation. I'd like to take a different take on that. If we can get there today in the hour, I have something prepared. If not, we'll just push it out to next time. And then I wanted to spend a few minutes at the end to talk about how the homework sessions are going to work, and yeah, how we go from here. So with that being said, let's go right into it. Or not, here we go. Where do I put myself so I don't disturb? Here we go. So first of all, Late Egyptian. Yeah, Late Egyptian is the first part of later Egyptian. What I mean by that is you can take the history of Egyptian and essentially break it up into two major parts. One is earlier Egyptian, which encompasses the language of the Old Kingdom, and also the classical Egyptian language of the Middle Kingdom. If you want to put a house number on it, that would essentially be the language that was, or something similar was spoken around 2000 BCE. And then stayed for a long time as the classical language, the language for higher level texts. Theological texts stay written in Middle Egyptian or Neo-Middle Egyptian until well into Roman times. So that's over 2000 years. I forgot when exactly the last hieroglyphic text that we have in Neo-Middle Egyptian was written. I think it was around 390 something CE. So that's actually not that long ago. So the classical language stayed as a written norm as a very long time, comparable to, for example, Latin in Europe, or for example, classical Chinese in China. So long after it was an actively spoken language, it stayed as a written standard, especially for higher level documents like official inscriptions, proclamations, theological texts. But of course, the language itself evolved in the meantime. And even though it wasn't really written down as it was spoken, you can tell from occasional slip-ups, from new vocabulary, from things that people do, that the language was changing as it was spoken. And then eventually, especially during the Amarna years, that starts to break through more. And then in the 19th dynasty, it becomes acceptable to write entire documents in Late Egyptian, in this new language. So that language stays on for about 1300 to 700 BCE as a written norm for everyday texts and for literary texts, in parallel to the classical Middle Egyptian, or rather its newborn form of Neo-Middle Egyptian, which is basically an artificial literary language. Late Egyptian evolves into Demotic and then eventually Coptic. Or let's put it this way, maybe it's not a direct straight line, but many features that change. Essentially, there is a linear progression from later Egyptian to Demotic, to late Egyptian to Demotic to Coptic. And together you can call them Egyptian II or later Egyptian. And they're very similar to each other. And the first two stages are very similar to each other. Coptic, of course, still lives on as a liturgical language in the Coptic Orthodox Church. So we have a very good understanding of this one. You can ask people how it works. Demotic is very similar to Coptic, just written in a different writing system. And then Late Egyptian is pretty similar to Demotic. We're going to see a bit about that later. So those three really belong together. So yeah, first written stage of Egyptian II or Late Egyptian. Let's say the core areas from 1300 to 700 BCE. So 19th dynasty, 20th dynasty, third intermediate period. Those first two dynasties are the Ramessides or Ramessids, however you want to pronounce it. So I think it's fair to call it the language of Ramses. And something important that you can see from the chart here, so there is the timeline, but there's also the level of the text. You have essentially a two-level system going on. Late Egyptian is the lower variant, the one that you use for hierarchically less prestigious texts, which includes literature, though, even includes some poetry. And then you have the H variant, the higher variant, which is always Neo-Middle Egyptian. So that's what you typically find on an official proclamation, on a temple wall, which you will find in religious texts. So yeah, that's an interesting state of affairs that you have, however, in many other languages as well, this kind of diglossia or digraphia. And let's illustrate a little bit what that looks like in practice. So how is Late Egyptian different from classical Middle Egyptian? And I thought the best way how to do this is by some practical examples. So I put this sentence together. I'm not really good at Middle Egyptian. If I make any mistakes, those of you who are, just please call it out. But if you wanted to say, for example, his son finds the letter, you could do it like this. I'm not even going to try to pronounce it in anything reconstructed. Egyptological pronunciation would be something like Mik Jem Saf Shat Ten. So look, find his son this letter, or letter this, essentially. That's how it's put together. If you look in Late Egyptian, the same thing would be Pefshure Kshimeche. So this is his. This is a new word for son or boy. Here's the infinitive for to find. You see, that's actually still the same word. You now have an article, the female form here. And then the word for letter is also still the same. But you can see there's quite a few things that happened here. The his from son moved to the front. The word for son changed. The structure of the sentence here, the verb is at the beginning. Here suddenly it's in the second position. And also the spelling of the word letter has changed. The T is gone at the end. So what you can see is lots of changes in such a simple sentence. And I have summarized some of them over here. So verb, subject, object becomes subject, verb, object in Late Egyptian, with often a conjugation prefix in front. You now have articles. You do have new vocabulary, or the meaning changes. This word, shure, in Middle Egyptian, it would mean small, but now you can also use it as the standard word for the boy or the child or the son, or with a slight variation also for the girl. You have pronunciation changes. You have some spelling changes. And yeah, if you put all that together, that's quite a significant change from classical Egyptian to Late Egyptian. Also, and this is interesting, I don't know Demotic, unfortunately, but if you look at Coptic, the same sentence in Coptic would be Pefshere Kshine Tepistole. And if you compare those, it's almost the same. Pefshure Kshine Teche, Pefshere Kshine Intepistole. The only things that change is now you have an object marker, and the word for letter has changed from the good old Egyptian to a Greek word. But that's it. So in my mind, honestly, they are two different languages, or at least we should treat them as such. A lot of the features I've pointed out here are already showing in Middle Egyptian, but if you put them all together cumulatively in a text, they make them different enough that you could say this is like Italian versus Latin in my mind, clearly related, but just two very different ways how to construct sentences. And it's quite close already to Coptic, which is really nice because then we can sort of guess the pronunciation in many cases. So maybe oh, yeah, I had a few more things I want to show here. Forgot about that. Other things which are really interesting about Late Egyptian, it explicitly marks tenses. That's something that you don't really have in Middle Egyptian. So you have these conjugation prefixes to indicate, for example, the first present, second tense, circumstantial, conjunctive, future three. This is taken from Horace and Seth. Many of you will recognize this from our reading group work. It also has articles. So definite article plural, singular, female and male, indefinite article, so a versus the, features that Middle Egyptian doesn't have like this. And that makes it very easy to parse Late Egyptian sentences because there's just way more structural information from those little words in there, at least in my mind. So that makes it a really good starting point. I'll pause here for a moment. Any questions or comments so far?
I have one question.
Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, I think someone is also want to ask some question. Can I ask?
Sure, go ahead. Yeah, I cannot really see the hands going up. I think I saw Rebecca, Shailish. Shailish, go first.
Yeah.
Go first.
Acha, okay. My question is, can we say that late Egyptian was an advanced version of Middle Egyptian, or it got developed separately? What can we say about this?
That's a really interesting question. So Late Egyptian continues a lot of features that you already see cropping up in Middle Egyptian. So it is it's evolving from Middle Egyptian. That being said, there are some things that show up in Late Egyptian that are present in Old Egyptian, but not in Middle Egyptian. So for example, there's something called a pathetic yod that's like a little like I vowel that shows up in certain verb forms, which you find in Old Egyptian, you find in Late Egyptian, but not in Middle. So it's not necessarily direct dialect continuity. One way how you could interpret these data is by assuming that maybe the dialect that Old Egyptian was based on had some similarities with the one that Late Egyptian is based on, and Middle Egyptian reflects a somewhat different norm geographically, like with capitals moving around and something like that. So that's one very interesting and fascinating theory. So I think it's probably a mixture of both. Great question. Rebecca, you had one too, right?
Yeah. I was just wondering, from your knowledge, given that the Greeks were in Egypt, did late Egyptian also have any Greek loanwords?
Too early, I would say. To my knowledge, Late Egyptian doesn't have it yet. It has a ton of loanwords from Canaanite, from Semitic languages. So you have a significant influx from people from that region, and that also shows in the vocabulary. And part of the interesting, we're going to get to that in a few sessions. Part of the interesting developments there is they needed a special orthography for that, because the traditional hieroglyphs, well, they evolved with the Egyptian language, and now you suddenly have this big influx of foreign vocabulary, and you somehow need to write it, and they had to come up with spelling conventions for that, which is pretty interesting. We'll get there in a few weeks. Great point.
And can I
really,
ask?
oh yeah, sorry. Go forward.
No, please go ahead. Please go ahead. I will ask later
Oh
on.
yeah. So earlier I had a question. So please go to the previous slide where you were comparing the Middle Egyptian. Yeah, Middle Egyptian, and yes, this one. So for Middle Egyptian, it is a verbal sentence, but for Late Egyptian, it is a first present, because gam is stative, right? So you here, I think, so a comment is required, because Middle Egyptian is a verbal sentence, and first present in Late Egyptian is like derives from the adverbial sentences of Middle Egyptian. Yes. So to compare them, I don't think it's very fair, because these are two separate like types of sentences.
First of all,
maybe we could like use the stative in the Middle Egyptian like part, not the verbal sentence. It's just a like a little suggestion, nothing of terrible importance, really.
No, it's a great comment. So I would say two things. First of all, you're absolutely correct, of course. They are, if you come from a traditional Middle Egyptian grammar framework, completely different sentences, the way that they're constructed. The Late Egyptian sentence, of course, being an adverbial sentence with either an infinitive or a stative in there as the predicate. Now, what's interesting is, though, the present one is the standard form, how you would build a lot of sentences in Late Egyptian, right? So in terms of functionally, if I want to say A does something, A reads a book, A is walking, or whatever, that becomes an adverbial sentence in Late Egyptian. So the point I was trying to make is, it is constructed very differently. Of course, you're right. If you want to look for the continuity, then these two examples don't really match. If you want to look at what's the equivalent in English, then we'd have to say Late Egyptian uses a very different construction, basically, which exists in Middle Egyptian, but which has a completely different field of application. Would that be fair?
Yes, I think so. So it's like a matter of like semantic equality between them, not something that like concerns like anything else. So they are the same in the way they want to express the same thing. I mean, yeah.
Right.
Okay.
Right.
Okay. Yeah.
That was the point I was going for. You're right. If you're looking like for historical continuity, then of course that's not the same thing. It's not like the verb suddenly jumps from beginning to the end or something. You're absolutely right.
Yeah, thank you very much.
Cool. No, thanks for calling that out. That's something I want to do a lot in these introductory sessions, is to really treat the language as a separate one. Just because when you look at it, if you look at Italian from the lens of Latin, you can say, oh, Italian is just bad Latin. But if you treat it as a language in its own right, then suddenly the picture changes. And I think that's a good approach for how to take Late Egyptian. Let's treat it on its own terms, so to say. But yeah, that's my very, very own approach there. More comments, more questions?
I had two small questions. Can I?
Yeah, of course.
Yeah, as I can see on the slide, you have written that Middle Egyptian was in use from 2000 BC to approximately 394 BC, and in the second point you have mentioned that Late Egyptian was in practice from around 1300 BC to 700 BC. So both the languages coexisted. Like in Iran, at the same time, Avesta and Old Persian coexisted. But Avestan region was mostly concentrated towards the Azerbaijan side, and Old Persian region was concentrated towards southeast of Iran. So was this the same case about the Egyptian? Like some part of Egypt was using Middle Egyptian, and some part of the provinces used to practice Late. Is it like that, or entirely these two languages were in practice throughout the ancient empire of Egypt?
To the best of my knowledge, it's really a question of the level of the text and not geographically. Was there geographic variation? For sure. I mean, it's such a big country. You would assume, just like in Coptic, you have 6 major dialects. You would assume that there was dialectal variation. But the difference between Middle Egyptian and Late Egyptian is primarily one of the genre, of the level of the text. Like I said, the closest example I can think of is Italian, French, etc. in the Middle Ages versus Latin, going on side by side. Classical Chinese and modern Chinese, basically, for a long time, where you also have that kind of diglossia between a more formal language and a less formal language. I hesitate to say classical Arabic and dialects, because the quote-unquote dialects aren't written that much to my knowledge. So that doesn't quite fit.
Yeah.
So it's really more a question of how formal is the text you're trying to write.
And last question. In around 522 BC, 520 BC, Cambyses of Achaemenids had conquered Egypt. And later on, we can see the name of Darius mentioned in Egyptian inscriptions. So, we had discussed last time on the WhatsApp. So, I wanted to ask that which language or was used to write the inscriptions related to Darius? Was it Middle Egyptian or Late Egyptian script?
Middle, Neo-Middle.
Middle Egyptian.
It's official government proclamation, so to say.
Okay.
It's similar to when, even in the US, you can sometimes find like building inscriptions in Latin, in big capital letters on the wall, outside wall of buildings. Same thing. You're going for the prestige variant.
Thank you so much.
And day to day, what people would have used in like their accounting documents, court proceedings, letters and whatnot, would have been demotic. So a somewhat evolved version of Late Egyptian in a highly cursive writing system. Eventually you find that put onto monuments as well, but that is much later. That's more like during Ptolemaic times. Everybody knows the Rosetta Stone that has demotic on there as well. And it's not the only one. There are more documents like this, multilingual. But that's a little bit later than this stage.
Thank you.
Cool. All right. Let me look at the clock. Let me go on a little bit. I had a quick example that I'm not going to go over in detail, but you'll all get the slides afterwards, and feel free to take a look. I took this from a really interesting thesis written in 2015, which basically collects different examples for inter-Egyptian translation. And for example, here, for this particular papyrus, now this is from 300 BCE, so much later than the area that we're looking at. We're looking at 1300 to 700 BCE, right? But we don't have any, or at least I'm not aware of much earlier translations. Here we have a bunch from that time. And essentially you have the older Middle Egyptian text together with the newer Proto-Demotic version in the possession of the same individual that survived. And so you can basically compare how the older version was rendered in the newer language, which essentially, I found the name for it, I mean, I found it described as Proto-Demotic. It has a lot of similarity, obviously, with Late Egyptian, if you look at the individual forms in here. So I think it's a good comparison for what we're talking about. Everything that's in red is where essentially the sense is the same, but the language has been updated. The parts that are in blue here, they also changed the sense. For those of you who already speak some form of Egyptian, take a look at that later. I found that instructive because obviously somebody found the need to translate from version A into version B. It's the same individual that had both. So that makes me think, at least at that later stage, people were really thinking about it as two different languages themselves. How they saw it in the early Ramesside years, I don't know, because it's quite common for people to have different levels of the same language and see them as one. Like, for example, classical Chinese is essentially often seen as a elevated register of Chinese, even though you wouldn't be able to communicate with it in the street. So that's an interesting topic, how you want to treat that. But that sort of, for me, indicates that treating them as two different languages is actually warranted, just from the fact that we have translations. Now, hang on, like I said, new computer, still figuring things out. Here we go. For those of you who are new to the Egyptian writing system, it's a combination orthography. You have phonetic signs and you have meaning signs. So I took my little sentence from before. His son finds the letter, basically. And let's just go through this phonetically. So the first word, pef, or paif, if you want to pronounce it Egyptologically speaking. The first sign here is a biconsonantal sign, P aleph, or P aleph. Then you have the aleph itself. You have the double reed leaf, commonly glossed as a glide, like a y sound, like a y sound. And then finally, the third person singular, the F, with the horned viper here at the end. You could have spelled the whole word, paif or pef, out just basically P aleph YF, but they don't do that. You have a sign for P plus aleph, and you're just going to use it. Why? Well, I know that there's several people on the call who speak Japanese, and if you're familiar with Japanese, for example, if you see text that's written only in hiragana, it's super annoying to parse. It's just this endless alphabet soup, especially without word separation in between. Having this alternation between multi-consonant signs and single consonant signs actually makes it easier, I think, for the brain to recognize. And so you find this mix between, you typically have multiple phonetic signs, one of which could be a multi-consonant sign, and then several single consonant signs, and often you have a meaning sign. Like, for example, in the next word, shure, sh, r, then another little, it's a reed leaf, like a is sound or yes sound. I'll get to that in a moment. Another consonant sign, the W, I'll talk about that later. And then those two here are not read aloud, but they're just meaning signs. The word originally means small, sheri in Middle Egyptian, and anything small or anything bad comes with a sparrow in Egyptian. And so the bad bird is what it's often called. Now, in this case, we're talking about the son or the boy. And to indicate that, we have the little man glyph here as well. So those two here are determinatives. They just indicate the meaning of the word, while the front part indicates the pronunciation. Next word, chime or geme, if you want to pronounce it Egyptologically. GM, by consonant sign, complemented with an extra M. That doesn't mean that there's like two M's to be read. It's just telling you, yep, I really meant that word that had an M in it. So essentially we're doubling it. Just like the aleph here in a way is superfluous. We're repeating the aleph that's already in the P here. And that's something an Egyptian likes to do in Middle Egyptian and Late Egyptian. You basically add so-called phonetic complements to the multi-consonant signs. Again, I think it helps with readability. Ta, the female article, is just written phonetically. And then the word for letter or document, a sh, an ein, and then again another determinative, some kind of string, and a little determinative stroke. Normally that's used to indicate that a sign really means what it shows. I think that could be a good way to describe it. In this case, it's almost more like a space filler. It's more aesthetics, I would say. So that's how it basically works. You have a phonetic component. You often have a meaning component at the end of the word. This is another determinative, typically for abstract things. It's a book roll. So it's this alternation of phonetic, meaning, phonetic, meaning, phonetic, meaning. And together that makes for a much richer script than if you just spell out things phonetically. I would say it's easier to parse. It also helps to disambiguate words that may have the same consonant structure. And we're going to go over those uniliterals in a moment. But before we go there, any questions on that? Because it's quite a bit to absorb, I think.
What did you mean when you said string at the end? Does that actually mean string?
It is a string. Yeah, it's a picture of a string. I think. I don't know. One of our Middle Egyptian specialists. Do you notice anything else?
Yeah, some kind of some kind of string, a rope, sometimes like something connected with the rope. Yeah.
And so why have we got the word string put on the end of this?
Ah, good point. So it's not really a separate word, but it's more, so this word means document or letter. And you want to put some kind of meaning sign at the end to indicate what field of meaning this belongs to. Just like for the boy, you have like the indication of small and it's a person. In this case, you need something to indicate letter. Honestly, if I had to write the word from scratch, I would have chosen a book roll and would have put that at the end because it's related to books and writing, right? That would be the most logical choice. But for some reason, the word in Egyptian is written with a string, maybe because it's tied up with a string, the letter, possibly. I don't know. Is that actually a thing? Because the letters I have seen are not really tied up. They are typically folded multiple times.
Oh, they are really. They are tied up and then a clay seal is put on them sometimes.
Right.
So you could put like an impression on it.
Exactly, to make sure it's not being tempered.
Yeah, it's kind of logical to put a string here. Yeah.
So I'm not quite sure why they did it, but it's a standard determinative at the end of that word. Sometimes you just have to accept them. Just like I'm not completely sure why to find has a book roll. I mean, why don't you put an eye or legs or something? But in late Egyptian, that one is the common determinative, that the common meaning sign that goes with the word to find.
The string determinative is also used to write the verb for unroll or unwrap or something. So one theory is that like a document's a thing you have to open to read, whereas the book roll itself tends to be used more for abstract concepts, things that you can't actually draw a picture of. So you have to just read it as written.
That is a great point. Yeah, that makes sense. I would buy that. Cool.
Yeah, and also interestingly, so according to my book, it also means headband, garland, or something like that's loose. And the word for swear or taking an oath is also written with the string sign. It's just that it doesn't have a sound. And also the last day of the month is also written with that sign along with the other uniliterals.
Right, fascinating. Yep. True. So
Is
sometimes
this a sound or an indicator? So does any sound come out of that?
nope. It's entirely meaning. And I apologize, the picture doesn't change to whoever is speaking. I'm trying to do that manually, but it doesn't work. I'll fix that next time. Normally, often it's clearer. Like, for example, when you have a word that's read that denotes a person, you typically have this sign at the end, unless it's a female person, in which case you would have a woman. If it's an animal, it depends. Actually, you know what? Let's park it for a moment. We'll have a few examples in a moment as an exercise, and then I think it will start to sink in. They typically pick a sign that makes a lot of sense for that particular word, and sometimes, like in this case, it's a bit more esoteric, why they pick that particular meaning sign. It's not always a straight one-to-one relationship for us nowadays. But let's look at a few examples together, and I think it will click. By the way, I'm very excited that we have several real Egyptologists, I'm not one, or Egyptology students on the call. So if I tell BS at some point in time or something is inaccurate, by all means, please point it out. I'm trying to double and triple check things, but there may be mistakes and better to correct them. I'm saying that with intention because I was going to go over the transliteration and pronunciation. If I got anything wrong, please call it out. I think most of you, many of you know this already, of course, from Middle Egyptian or from previous study. So I'll go over this comparatively quickly. But so in a nutshell, Egyptian writes, generally speaking, the consonants, not the vowels. I say generally speaking, because some of these guys here show up as a placeholder for vowels. And especially in late Egyptian, you could make the argument that quite a few of the weak consonants are actually being used as vowel indicators. I'll talk about that probably a bit more in the next session. But in general, the overwhelming structure of the writing system is consonant-based. And so let's talk a bit about the different phonemes that are in here and the key uniliteral signs. You have a set basically of uniliteral signs, one consonant being depicted by them. This bird here, the aleph, that's essentially, by late Egyptian, we assume that is either a glottal stop, like uh-oh, the kind of consonant sound between those two vowels, or even just a vowel marker, depending on where it is in the word and on the word. It's conventionally transliterated by this symbol, or there's a system that's called manual decodage, which you can use on computers where you don't really have the fonts for this, and there it's just like a big R, capital A. And it's being pronounced in Egyptological pronunciation as an R sound, like a sound. So that would be R. What with that Egyptological pronunciation, for those of you who are new, essentially, since the vowels aren't written, you have to do something. And the convention is to insert little A's, little E sounds in between consonants, with the exception of a few weak consonants, which are pronounced as, well, in this case, like an A. Or in this case of the reed leaf, the conventional pronunciation there is E. So I always flip between how you actually say it and then the English letter name. So of course in English we would call that an I, right? Transliterated, well, either this little I with a glottal stop-like sign on top, or a J. I'll be using the J. I think Neveu uses this one. Honestly, it's really just a question of convention. You can use either one. In reality, in late Egyptian, this is probably either a vowel marker or, again, a glottal stop, depending on where it is in the word. The double reed leaf typically corresponds to a glide in Coptic, conventionally transliterated with a Y, or Christian had it as a double reed leaf. You could make a good argument for both. Neveu goes with this, so I'll do the same. Manuel de Codage, also a Y. This little guy here is not really a separate sign in the alphabet, but it occurs a lot, so I wanted to point it out. Often traditionally transcribed as a Y as well. A good case can be made for actually having it equivalent to the reed leaf. We had a long discussion on this in Christian's earlier course. I'm going to go with this just because Neveu does that with the Y. Maybe we can get into this in a little bit more detail later. Egyptologically, you typically pronounce them, well, how do you pronounce them? Typically as a glide as well. So like in pi, for example, there would be a Y at the end, Y sound. If you guys can pronounce an ein from Arabic, great, I can't. But that's basically what that glyph stood for, at least at that time still. So like a deeper sound in the throat. Ein, I can't do it, unfortunately. Egyptologically, it's pronounced as an A again. Later in Coptic, you can argue that it may in the beginning still be a glottal stop and then eventually goes away. Details on that are a little bit murky. Depends on what you think of double vowels, what they mean in Coptic. Then we have the wow, the little quail chick. Basically a W kind of sound. B, probably a B, could have been like in Spanish, could be like a B, kind of sound. That's what it later becomes in Coptic, like beta, not beta, but beta, so more like halfway to a V. P was probably aspirated. F is just an F. Unless, of course, you speak Japanese, then you may have some other opinions of what that sound, what it should sound like. Traditionally, it's just pronounced by Egyptologists as an F. Oops. That is not working. Here we go. I hope most of you had a chance to review this before the call. Otherwise, I'm going through this way too quickly. But M, N, R, not too much to say here, apart from that R was somewhere between an R and an L. You can see that from Coptic. You can see it from how foreign words are being transcribed. So in Fayumic, that later becomes an L in Fayumic Coptic. So it may have been somewhere between R and L, just like in Korean or Japanese. Sometimes N develops into an L later. So, or is also corresponds to an L in Proto-Afro-Asiatic. So there are some arguments to be made that sometimes this could be standing for an L, this sign, but typically we just interpret it as an N. There's a special combination of those two characters to transcribe Semitic L. We'll get there in a little bit. There are many H sounds. There's the normal H. There's a more emphatic one, like a ch. There is the so-called smiley H, pronounced like Bach or Loch. There is this little glyph, which is conventionally pronounced as sh, like in ich in German. The assumption here being that basically it's some kind of palatized, I'm pronouncing this wrong, palatal, yeah, a palatal consonant. So a little bit of a yes sound in there. These can become sh in Coptic, or they can stay an H sound. Depends on the word, depends on the environment. We have two S's. In Middle Egyptian, they're distinct, but in Late Egyptian, essentially, it's just sa, 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 sa. And that's why it also stays generally in Coptic.
One question I have.
Yes, sir.
Yeah, you mentioned transliteration in between. So they are Middle Egyptian transliteration as compared to Late Egyptian, right? On the right hand side is Late Egyptian, correct?
Not quite. Thanks for pointing it out. Great question.
Oh.
This is how it's traditionally transliterated for both Middle and Late Egyptian. They use the same transliteration. This is how we think it is actually pronounced, or at least I'm following Alan's reconstruction here from his excellent ancient Egyptian phonology. This is how we think the sounds were actually realized. This is how it's traditionally transcribed. And for example, we still transcribe, you can still transcribe this S sound as a Z, even though in Middle Egyptian, there was really no difference in pronunciation between the two. I think that already went away went away in Middle Egyptian. Late Egyptian is definitely the same sound. So this here is an attempt of how it was actually pronounced. In terms of how to transcribe it, I'd like to ask you use either this one, or if you're struggling with those extra diacritics, use the MDC, the Manuel de Codage transcription. So instead of H dot, just make it a capital H. I'm hoping that makes some sense.
And for reading the text, which transliteration should we prefer? Means the given on the right hand side or on the left hand side?
I think anybody who's a little bit into Egyptology will use either this one or this one, depending on the forum. For the longest time, all these extra characters were extremely hard to type on a computer. So people were using the MDC instead. And you also don't know if you type this, if your recipient, for example, has the right font installed and can even read them. But now they're in Unicode. The way that Marwan Kilani put it was, we now have aleph, let's write alephs. Because one of the problems you have, for example, if you search for a word online, say I wanted to just type the article, P aleph. Well, do I write P aleph, or do I write P capital A, or do I write P and letter 3? Depending on who wrote the text when, you will find all three, which means searching for something in Google in Egyptian is such a pain because you have to go through all the possible variants. So I would recommend for everybody to use the scholarly transliteration, but since that can be a real pain if you don't have the font installed, you also want to be conversant in the MDC transliteration, because you'll see that a lot, especially on online forums.
Can I ask a quick question?
Yeah.
On the fonts, because I haven't got onto the Discord thing yet, which font should we do for the purposes of this class? What's it called?
Ooh, there are multiple, depending on if you're on Mac or if you're on
I'm
web.
on Mac.
Yeah, oh, that's good. There are two great fonts. I'll put that in on the Discord later. There's one called, what's it called? Egyptian Hiero, I think. And the other one is called Egyptus. And what they both do, let me just forward a little bit here. They actually allow you to put words into little nice squares, like what I'm doing here, which all the other fonts don't. Actually, that also works on Windows. So that's probably something we should talk about in a follow-up session. How do you actually do this? The ground has shifted in the last few years. This you couldn't do before without using a software called JSash. And now you can actually do this in Word or Keynote or Pages or whatever your preferred software is. And you can get them into the right formatting. That's really a huge development in very recent time. So let's take that offline later, but there's some great solutions there, especially for the Mac. Oh boy, this hour is just flying by. Let me do this. This one took longer than I thought. Let me quickly cover this page, and then we take the exercises as like a homework and do a little bit of Q&A, if that's okay with everybody. I'll just quickly go through those letters real quick. So the sh sound, essentially, indicated with a little, what do we call that again? Is that what is that one thing called again?
Shen or shy?
Say again?
Shen or shy? That's what I heard.
Shen or shy, right? But how do you call that little hut check, right? Is that a
Oh, the hut check, yeah.
It's a hut check.
Or
So
Karen.
and in MDC, it's normally a capital S. So capital versus lowercase means something in MDC. While I mean, and if you use the quote unquote more scholarly transliteration, you would just use the hut check. It's a sh sound. It's still a sh sound in Coptic. This guy here is either transliterated K dot or Q. It's a K sound. Alan is proposing that in Late Egyptian, the main difference between those two is that this one's aspirated, this one is not. And he thinks that this one here is palatalized. There are some good arguments to be made for that from Coptic. Traditionally, this one here is transliterated as a Q, this one as a K, this one as a G. Honestly, since our Egyptian pronunciation is always going to be an approximation, I wouldn't be too religious on it. If you want to pronounce this guy here as a G, that's fine. If you want to pronounce it as a K with a little palatal glide like I did a moment ago into find, I would pronounce it chime, but if you want to pronounce the word geme, I think everybody will know what's meant. And there are certainly also dialects in Egyptological pronunciation. Modern ones. Doesn't have anything to do with the ancient pronunciation. So 3 different K sounds. And then last but not least, a bunch of T sounds, namely the basic T, probably aspirated. Then there is a palatalized version of that. So che. This one here is traditionally transliterated as a D with a hand glyph. Probably actually in Late Egyptian, just an unaspirated T, sutta. And again, a palatal version of that, je, which very often still is a palatal in Coptic, like for example in Jo to say, spelled with the same cobra glyph in Middle Egyptian. So there you have it in total, a set of uniliterals, which in principle would allow you to write all Egyptian words. That covers essentially the phonetic inventory of the language. Well, with some reservations, I'll have to talk about the L a little bit more and some details. But overall, you could write everything this way. In reality, of course, there are way more signs. There are meaning signs and there are multi-consonant signs that we're going to get into in the next sessions. What I wanted to do originally in this session is go over these uniliteral exercises. But I would say let's leave that for the next time. The expectation would be, please review those, and then we can go through them together. I think in total it's 7 pages. I think we can cover those in an hour. So proposal would be, if you guys agree, next time we'll just go through that exercise together and answer any questions as we go along. And then also the whole setup with determinatives and sound signs will become much clearer for those who are new to the writing system. With 7 minutes left on the clock, I would say let's just do a little bit more Q&A if there are more questions.
I've got one.
Okay, go
But
ahead.
I know this is kind of mixed ability, and I'm regarding myself as the lower ability. And if someone watches this video, what's palatalized mean?
Palatalized, yeah. Basically, if somebody's good in phonetics, you guys can probably explain it better than me. My attempt would be, so the palate, when the tongue goes a little bit back from behind the teeth, and you make the kind of like y sound, that imparts a certain quality on the consonant. So like if you have a T and if I palatalize, it becomes more like a ch. Same for a K, it becomes like a q. So essentially, typically a consonant gets palatalized because you have some kind of front vowel like an I or U after it. That's the way I would describe it. If somebody can do a better job, by all means, please go ahead. More thoughts on that? It does all sorts of things to stops in any language. Like, for example, if you look at nation in English, originally it would be natio in natio, natione or nationis in Latin, and then it becomes natio or natio, nation in English. So basically, by having like a front vowel or a glide after stop, it changes that nature of the stop, and that happens in Egyptian too.
What does glide mean?
Like a y in this case, like a y sound. Like for example, what's a good example? Like cute, or let's say, what's a good example? I'm trying to think of an English word right now. Suit versus suit. The difference between the first and the second is that the suit has a Y glide before the U sound. So that would be a Y glide. You can also have W glides. That's why I make a distinction there. It's like a little consonant or semi-vowel between a consonant and the following vowel.
And I would maybe say it's kind of like a consonant, and then it divides other vowels, but you don't stop the air with your tongue or your teeth or your lips, and you're not making a different sound like with an S or an H where you sort of force air through a constriction. So it's pronounced like a vowel, but it sort of functions a little bit like a consonant, and so you're sort of gliding from one vowel to another without actually stopping or changing the way the air flows. And so that's why like words like cute, you're sort of sliding from the U to the E.
Thank you, it's very helpful. I'm not embarrassed to ask stupid questions because I know that this is on other people like me also won't understand.
I'm really happy you asked, because what I think is, if I have a question, typically somebody else has it as well. And so by all means, if there are no stupid questions, really, any questions you guys may have, please ask. And so on the one hand, I also wanted to say that I'm trying to start this from scratch. On the other hand, we also have a lot of very advanced members, so I'm trying to find a balance. So asking for a bit of indulgence there for those guys who already know Middle Egyptian very well. I'm trying to ramp it up quickly, but during the first few sessions, we'll have to go over some of the basics. At the same time, if you're new to it and it's going too fast, please tap on the brakes. I'd rather that we slow down a bit or go over something twice than that people just drop off and say, oh, you know what, I'll catch up later. That's probably not going to happen. If it's not clear in the beginning, let's go over it twice rather than delaying it and then losing people. So yeah, this whole thing is very much an experiment, and any call outs on how to do it better are very much appreciated. All right, guys. I talked way more than I was intending to. Apologies. I would say, why don't we pick up with the exercises the next time? Everybody should have them. If you don't have them, ping me. Then something went wrong with the email. Maybe you want to fill them in already by yourself so we can go over them comparatively quickly and answer questions more than finding our way through the spellings. That would be my proposal. One question I'd have is, should we just do this next week, considering that we didn't get quite as far as I was thinking? For a set of exercises that follow on today's quote-unquote lesson, but I think we should go through this stuff first. So my proposal would be continue on this next week. Maybe if I can have a quick yay or nay.
I agree.
Yeah? Trying to. All right.
Yeah.
Thanks so much. Then I would say, well, thanks so much for joining. Really appreciate it. This is an exciting experiment, and look forward to seeing you all at the same time then next week. And any questions in between, let's do them via Discord.
Great. Thank you so
All right.
much, Aurelio.
Yeah, thanks, Aurelia.
Thank you, Aurelio.
Thank you.
Thank you.
All right, thanks.
Thank you.
Have a good one. Enjoy the rest of
Thank
your
you.
weekend.
Thank you.
Bye.
Ciao.
Bye-bye. Thanks.
Bye.